The year was 2247, and humanity had finally reached the stars. Commander Jake Morrison sat in the captain's chair of the Horizon Explorer, a small research vessel that glided through the darkness of space. His eyes scanned the control panels as his crew worked quietly around him. The ship was on a simple mission, nothing dangerous or complicated. They were supposed to catalog mineral deposits in a region called the Outer Rim. It's far from Earth, but still within what humans considered safe territory. The mission was expected to take 3 months before they would return home to their families and friends. Jake was not alone on this journey. His wife Lisa sat at the science station, her fingers dancing across the holographic displays as she analyzed data from the latest planet scan. She was a xenobiologist, one of the best Earth had to offer, and she loved her work more than anything except her family. Their daughter Emma, only 7 years old, sat in a small corner of the bridge with her tablet, drawing pictures of the stars they passed. The United Earth government had recently changed the rules to allow families on certain research missions, believing that long separations were harder on people than the minimal risks of deep space. Exploration. Emma looked up from her drawing and smiled at her father. Her brown hair was tied in 2 ponytails, and her eyes sparkled with the innocent joy that only a child could have. She had drawn their ship flying past a purple planet with 3 moons. Jake smiled back at her and felt his heart swell with love. This mission was perfect because he got to work and be with his family at the same time. What could be better than showing his daughter the wonders of the universe? The Horizon Explorer crossed into a new sector in the navigation system. Beeped softly. Jake checked the readings and saw nothing unusual. The space around them was empty except for a few asteroids and some dust clouds. They were exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they had permission to do. Earth had sent diplomatic messages to all known species in this region, informing them of the research mission and requesting safe passage. Everyone had either agreed or not responded, which was taken as acceptance. What Jake did not know was that the Krell sovereignty had claimed this entire region as their territory just 2 months ago. The Krell were a reptilian species that controlled over 200 star systems through military might and intimidation. They believed that power was the only thing that mattered in the universe. Their empire had existed for thousands of years, and they had conquered dozens of other species. To the Krell, humans were newcomers, barely worth noticing, certainly not worth respecting. The Krell patrol fleet appeared on the sensors without warning. 6 massive warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and surrounded the Horizon Explorer. Each Krell vessel was 10 times larger than the human research ship and bristled with weapons. Jake felt his stomach drop as he stared at the tactical display. He had never seen Krell ships before, except in training videos, and those videos had made it clear that the Krell were not friendly. Lisa grabbed Emma and held her close. The little girl looked confused and scared. She could tell from her parents' faces that something was very wrong. Jake opened a communication channel and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage. He identified himself and his ship, explained their peaceful research mission, and offered to leave the area immediately if there was any misunderstanding. He waited for a response, hoping that this was just a routine check and that the Krell would let them go. The face that appeared on the main screen made Jake's blood run cold. War Master Zethric was a towering Krell with dark green scales and yellow eyes that showed no warmth or mercy. He stared at Jake with the expression of someone looking at an insect. Zethric listened to Jake's explanation without any change in his expression. When Jake finished speaking, Zethric was silent for a long moment. Then Zethric spoke in perfect English, his voice deep and cold. He said that humans had no right to be in Krell space. He said that this region belonged to the Krell sovereignty and that any trespassers would be dealt with harshly. Jake tried to argue that they had not known about the Krell claim, that Earth had received no notification, that they were willing to leave immediately and never return. He begged for understanding, for mercy, for simple common sense. Zethric smiled. It was the cruelest smile Jake had ever seen. The War Master said that he would send a message that all humans would understand. He said that when lesser species entered Krell space, there were consequences. He cut the communication channel before Jake could say another word. Jake shouted orders to his crew. They needed to run, to get away as fast as possible. The engines powered up to maximum and the Horizon Explorer turned to flee. But they were too slow and the Krell ships were too fast. The first plasma blast hit their rear shields and the entire ship shook violently. Alarms blared throughout the vessel as systems began to fail. Jake managed to send an emergency distress signal toward Earth. Knowing it would take weeks for anyone to receive it, months for help to arrive, the second blast took down their shields completely. Lisa covered Emma with her own body, trying to protect her daughter from what was coming. Jake looked back at them, and their eyes met for a brief moment. He saw love and fear and desperate hope in his wife's face. He wanted to go to them, to hold them, to somehow save them. But he had to keep trying to pilot the ship. The Krell. Warships moved into a pattern that Jake recognized from his tactical training. They were not trying to disable the ship anymore. They were going to destroy it completely. The third blast tore through the hull and hit the living quarters directly. The compartment where Lisa and Emma were sitting, explosive, decompressed, in an instant. Jake screamed as he heard the alerts that told him that section of the ship was gone. Everything after that was a blur of pain and chaos. Jake felt the ship breaking apart around him. He felt himself being thrown against the walls as the gravity failed. He felt the cold of space trying to suck the air from his lungs. His last conscious thought was of Emma's smile and her drawing of the purple planet. Then, an escape pod automatically ejected and everything went black. When Jake woke up 3 days later, he was in a hospital on Earth. The recovery team had found his pod floating in the debris field, where the Horizon Explorer used to be. He was the only survivor. Admiral Paul Grant sat beside his bed with a face full of sorrow. The Admiral did not want to say the words, but he had no choice. Lisa and Emma were gone. The Krell had killed them. The ship's final recording showed everything. And it was clear that Zethric had ordered his ships to deliberately target the civilian living quarters even after the Horizon Explorer was already disabled and helpless. Jake lay in that hospital bed and felt something break inside him that would never heal. His wife was dead. His daughter was dead. They had been murdered for no reason except to send a message. He stared at the ceiling and felt rage building inside him like a fire that would never go out. The Admiral left the room quietly, and Jake was alone with his grief and his fury. The footage from the Horizon Explorer spread across Earth within hours. 8 billion humans watched as a child was killed simply because she existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. People poured into the streets in every city on the planet. They were not just sad, they were angry in a way that humanity had not been angry in generations. They demanded justice. They demanded action. They demanded that the Krell sovereignty pay for what they had done. The United Earth government faced a population that was united for the first time in history. Every nation, every culture, every group of humans agreed on one thing. This could not stand. The Krell had made a terrible mistake. They had killed a human child, and now they would learn what happened when you made humanity angry. Earth was going to war. President Helen Carter stood before the United Earth Assembly with cameras broadcasting her words to every corner of the planet. Her face was calm, but her eyes showed the steel determination that had gotten her elected. She spoke clearly and slowly, so that everyone would understand. The Krell sovereignty had committed an act of war against humanity. They had murdered innocent civilians, including a 7-year-old child. Earth would not let this crime go unpunished. The time for peaceful diplomacy was over. Humanity was going to defend itself with every resource at its disposal. The assembly hall erupted in applause that lasted for 5 minutes. Representatives from every nation on Earth stood and cheered. For the first time in recorded history, humanity was completely united behind a single cause. Old enemies shook hands and former rivals embraced. The petty disputes that had divided humans for centuries suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of this external threat. Earth had one enemy now, and that enemy was the Krell Admiral. Paul Grant received orders to take command of the United Earth Defense Fleet. He was a career military officer who had served for 40 years and seen action in 3 different colonial disputes. He was known for being smart, tough, and unwilling to waste lives on pointless gestures. When the president told him to prepare for war with the Krell, he did not hesitate. He immediately began organizing the largest military mobilization in human history. Shipyards that normally built cargo vessels and passenger liners switched to military production overnight. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock, designing new weapons and improving existing ones. Factories that made household appliances retooled their assembly lines to produce ammunition, armor plating, and missile components. Humanity's industrial capacity had always been impressive because humans had spent centuries competing with each other. Now all of that competitive energy was focused on a single goal. Young men and women lined up at recruitment centers in numbers that overwhelmed the system. The military had to turn away volunteers because there were not enough training facilities to handle them all. People wanted to serve, wanted to fight, wanted to make the Krell pay for what they had done. The anger that burned across Earth was not hot and wild, but cold and focused. This was not about revenge in the emotional sense. This was about justice and survival. Jake Morrison refused to stay in the hospital. He discharged himself against medical advice after only 2 weeks of recovery. His body still ached from the injuries he had sustained when his ship was destroyed, but his mind was clear. He went directly to the recruitment office and demanded to be put back on active duty. The officers there tried to tell him that he needed more time to heal, that he should take leave and grieve for his family, that rushing back to service was not healthy. Jake looked them in the eyes and said he would find a way to fight whether they helped him or not. Something in his voice made them understand that he was not making an idle threat. They fast-tracked him through officer training and combat certification. His experience as a ship commander and his intimate knowledge of the Outer Rim made him valuable. More than that, his personal connection to the conflict made him a symbol that other soldiers could rally behind. Within 2 months, Jake was assigned as executive officer on a brand new destroyer called Earth's Fury under the command of Captain Daniel Hayes. The Krell sovereignty received reports about Earth's military. Build up and responded with contempt. There. High Command laughed at the idea that humans could pose a serious threat. The Krell had been fighting wars for thousands of years and had defeated every enemy they had ever faced. They saw humans as primitives who had barely left their home planet, children playing with weapons they did not understand. War Master Zethric was promoted and celebrated for his decisive action against human trespassers. He received medals and honors while Jake Morrison buried an empty coffin because there were no bodies to recover. The Krell decided to send a small fleet to Earth to teach the humans a final lesson. They would destroy the human homeworld and end this annoyance quickly. High Command dispatched 30 warships under the command of Fleet Master Korvax with orders to pacify Earth and accept humanity's surrender. Korvax was an experienced officer who had led successful campaigns against 6 other species. He expected this mission to be routine and boring. What the Krell did not understand was that humanity had spent its entire existence fighting itself. Every war, every battle, every conflict in human history had been studied and analyzed. Human military academies taught thousands of years of tactics ranging from ancient cavalry charges to modern space combat. Humans had learned to be flexible, creative, and ruthless when necessary. They could adapt faster than any species the Krell had ever encountered. Because adaptation was built into human nature, the Krell fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system and began there. Approached to Earth, they moved in a traditional formation. That had worked for them countless times before. A strong center with 2 wings that could envelop any enemy who tried to flank them. It was a formation that emphasized strength and intimidation. The Krell ships advanced steadily, their shields at maximum power and their weapons charged. Admiral Grant watched the Krell, his fleet on his tactical display, and smiled grimly. He had studied every piece of information that had been recovered from the Horizon Explorer. He knew how the Krell fought, and he knew their weaknesses. The human defensive fleet of 50 ships appeared on Krell sensors, and the Krell commanders felt even more confident. They outnumbered the humans, and their ships were individually more powerful. This would be easy. Grant gave the order, and the human fleet scattered in what looked like panic. Ships broke formation and fled in different directions. The Krell took this as confirmation that humans were cowards who could not stand up to superior force. Korvax ordered his fleet to pursue and destroy the fleeing humans. The Krell formation spread out as they chased different targets. And that was exactly what Grant wanted. The Krell fleet passed through an area of space near Mars that appeared to be empty. Thousands of small objects that had been floating dormant suddenly activated. These were stealth mines, too small for Krell sensors to detect until it was too late. Each mine was basically a proximity fuse attached to a shaped explosive charge. When the Krell ships passed within range, the mines detonated in a coordinated pattern that had been planned down to the millisecond. Explosions rippled through the Krell formation. Shields flickered and failed under the unexpected assault. Ships collided with each other as captains tried to evade the mines and ended up in each other's paths. The perfect Krell formation dissolved into chaos. Alarms blared on every Krell ship as damage reports flooded in. Korvax shouted orders, but his communications network was disrupted, and half his fleet could not hear him. That was when the human ships returned. They came from behind Mars, from the asteroid belt. From angles the Krell had not been watching because they had been too focused on the pursuit. Human destroyers and cruisers hit the disorganized Krell fleet from multiple directions at once. Railguns fired, tungsten rounds accelerated to a fraction of light speed. These projectiles punched through Krell shields like they were not even there and tore massive holes in ship hulls. Missile swarms launched from human ships and overwhelmed Krell point defense systems. The Krell had designed their defenses to handle a certain number of incoming threats, but humans launched 10 times that many missiles. Some were decoys and some were real, but the Krell systems could not tell the difference until it was too late. Explosions blossomed across Krell. Warships as missiles found their targets. Jake stood at a station on the Earth's. Fury and coordinated weapons fire with cold precision. He watched Krell ships break apart on his display and felt nothing except satisfaction. These were the people who had killed his daughter. These were the people who thought humans were beneath notice. He was showing them exactly how wrong they were. Every shot he fired was for Emma. Every Krell ship that exploded was justice delivered. The battle lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, the Krell fleet was completely destroyed. 30 warships reduced to wreckage floating in space. The human fleet had lost only 3 ships and suffered minor damage to a dozen others. It was a victory beyond what anyone had expected. Admiral Grant had proven that humans could not just fight the Krell, but could defeat them decisively. News of the battle spread across human space within hours. People celebrated in the streets and danced with joy. But Grant knew this was only the beginning. The Krell would not accept this defeat. They would send more ships, bigger fleets, and they would be angry. Earth had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. Grant looked at the casualty reports from the 3 ships they had lost. 217 humans had died in this victory. He thought about Jake Morrison and wondered how many more would die before this war ended. The Krell High Command received the news of their fleet's destruction with shock and disbelief. It was impossible. Humans were not supposed to be able to fight like this. The admirals and generals argued about what had gone wrong and who was to blame. War Master Zethric stood before them and declared that humanity must be completely destroyed. The Krell could not allow this insult to stand. He demanded full military mobilization and the authority to lead the war effort personally. The High Command agreed. Every Krell world began building ships and training soldiers. The sovereignty would crush these upstart humans and remind the galaxy why the Krell were feared. But even as they made their plans, doubt crept into some minds. If humans could destroy a Krell fleet so easily, what else were they capable of doing? Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of Earth's Fury and watched as 200 human warships prepared to jump into enemy territory. This was the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled in one place. Every ship was crewed by volunteers who knew exactly what they were getting into. The mission was dangerous, and many of them would not come back alive. They were going to strike at the heart of Krell military power in the Draken system, a heavily defended region deep inside, an enemy space where the Krell built most of their warships. Captain Daniel Hayes sat in the command chair reviewing the final attack plans. He was a quiet man who rarely raised his voice, but every crew member respected him completely. He had fought in the Mars battle, and his tactical decisions had saved dozens of lives. Now he was leading Earth's Fury into the most dangerous mission of the war. He looked over at Jake and nodded. They were ready. The fleet jumped together, and space twisted around them in ways that human minds could barely comprehend. Faster-than-light travel was still new to humanity, and the experience of jumping was uncomfortable and disorienting. Jake felt his stomach lurch as reality bent and reformed. Then they were through and emerging into Krell space, hundreds of light years from Earth. Alarms screamed immediately. A Krell defense fleet of 80 ships was already moving to intercept them. The Krell had improved their sensor networks after the Mars disaster, and they had detected the human fleet's arrival within seconds. Jake's hands flew across his console as he brought weapon systems online. This was going to be a fight, and there was no time to prepare, Captain. Hayes gave the order to engage, and space erupted into chaos. Human ships broke into their pre-planned squadron formations and moved to meet the Krell fleet. Earth's Fury led a group of 12 destroyers that angled toward the Krell right flank. Jake coordinated targeting data with the other ships in their squadron. They had practiced these maneuvers dozens of times, but doing them in actual combat with lives on the line was completely different. The first Krell plasma bolts crossed the distance between the fleets and human ships began evasive maneuvers. The bolts were powerful enough to vaporize a ship with a direct hit, but they traveled in straight lines and could be dodged if you saw them coming. Human point defense lasers shot down some of the bolts, while others missed by meters. One destroyer called the Swift Justice took a glancing hit that stripped away half its armor, but the ship kept fighting. Jake locked weapons onto a Krell cruiser and fired. Railgun rounds streaked across space at incredible velocity. The tungsten projectiles hit the Krell shields and punched straight through them. Holes appeared in the cruiser's hull, and atmosphere vented into space. The Krell ship tried to return fire, but Jake had already shifted targets to a Krell destroyer that was lining up a shot on one of the human frigates. The battle was intense and confused. Ships maneuvered in 3 dimensions, trying to gain advantage over their enemies. Human vessels worked in coordinated pairs and triplets, covering each other and concentrating fire on single targets. The Krell fought more independently, with each captain trying to prove their individual courage and skill. It was a cultural difference that gave humans a tactical edge. Earth's Fury dodged between 2 Krell battleships and launched a full spread of missiles at point-blank range. The missiles covered the short distance in seconds and overwhelmed the Krell point defenses. Explosions tore through both enemy ships, and they began to drift out of formation. Captain Hayes immediately ordered the ship to move to the next target. There was no time to celebrate, or even to confirm kills. They had to keep moving and keep fighting. Jake thought about Emma constantly as he worked. Every time he fired weapons, he pictured her smile. Every time he saw a Krell ship explode, he felt a grim satisfaction. This was what justice looked like. This was what happened when you murdered a child and thought there would be no consequences. The Krell were learning that humanity did not forgive and did not forget. The human fleet punched through the Krell defensive line after 90 minutes of brutal combat. They left behind the wreckage of 30 Krell ships and continued toward their primary objective. The orbital shipyards of Draken hung in space like massive metal cities. Each shipyard was kilometers long and could construct multiple warships simultaneously. Intelligence reports suggested that the Krell were building their next generation of super battleships in these facilities. Destroying the shipyards would set back Krell's military production by years. Earth's Fury and its squadron accelerated toward the nearest shipyard. Defensive platforms opened fire, and space filled with plasma bolts and missile trails. Human ships wove between the incoming fire while returning shots of their own. Jake targeted the defensive platforms methodically, destroying them one by one to clear a path. Behind them, other human squadrons engaged different sections of the shipyard network. Captain Hayes brought the ship in close to the primary shipyard. Jake could see Krell workers evacuating through his visual sensors. Small transport ships fled the station in all directions. Part of him felt bad for them because they were probably just regular people doing their jobs. But then he remembered that these were the people who built the ships that killed his family. His sympathy vanished. The targeting computer locked onto the shipyard's main reactor complex. This was the power source that ran the entire facility. Destroying it would cause a cascade failure throughout the structure. Jake checked the firing solution 3 times to make sure it was perfect. Captain Hayes looked at him and asked if he was ready. Jake nodded and placed his finger on the firing control. The words came out cold and steady when Jake spoke. He said, "Fire, and every weapon on Earth's fury discharged simultaneously." Railgun rounds and missiles converged on the reactor complex from multiple angles. The first impacts breached the containment fields and the reactor began to overload. Secondary explosions rippled outward as backup power systems failed and fuel reserves ignited. The shipyard tore itself apart in a spectacular display of destruction that lit up the darkness of space. Similar scenes played out across the Draken system. As other human squadrons hit their assigned targets, within 3 hours, every major Krell shipyard in the system was reduced to debris floating in orbit. Decades of construction work and trillions of credits and infrastructure were gone. The human fleet regrouped and prepared to jump back to friendly space before Krell. Reinforcements could arrive, but the victory had come at a terrible cost. Earth's fury had taken multiple hits during the assault. The ship's armor was breached in 6 places, and 2 of the main engines were offline. Throughout the fleet, the situation was similar or worse. 40 human ships had been destroyed completely, and another 30 were so damaged they could barely move. Captain Hayes limped Earth's fury back toward the rally point while damage control teams worked frantically to keep critical systems. Running Jake walked through the ship after the battle and saw the price of war firsthand. The medical bay was overflowing with injured crew members. Burns, broken bones, decompression injuries, and worse, filled every bed and spilled out into the corridors. Doctors and nurses worked without rest trying to save as many people as possible. Jake stopped beside a young engineer who had lost both legs when a console exploded. The kid could not have been more than 20 years old, and he looked up at Jake with pain-filled eyes. The engineer asked if they had one, and if the mission was successful. Jake knelt down beside the bed and told him yes. They had destroyed the shipyards and dealt a major blow to the Krell war effort. The engineer smiled weakly and said it was worth it then. Jake wanted to agree, but looking at all the wounded and thinking about the ships that would never come home, he was not sure anymore. War destroyed everyone it touched, regardless of which side won the battle. Earth's fury made it back to human space, along with most of the fleet. Admiral Grant declared the Draken raid a strategic success, but his face showed no joy. Nearly a quarter of the human fleet was gone, and thousands of families would be receiving death notifications. Grant knew that more battles were coming, and each one would cost more lives. He wondered how long humanity could sustain this level of casualties before the will to fight began to crack. News of the Draken raid shocked the Krell sovereignty to its core. For the first time in their long history, the Krell heartland had been successfully attacked. Planets that had never known fear suddenly installed defense systems and evacuation procedures. Citizens who had always felt safe began to question whether their government could actually protect them. The Krell High Command called emergency meetings and shouted at each other about what had gone wrong. War Master Stethrick stood before the High Command and declared that humanity must be exterminated completely. He said that humans were not just enemies, but a threat to the entire Krell way of life. He demanded unlimited resources and absolute authority to prosecute the war. The High Command, frightened by what humans had accomplished, gave him everything he asked for. Zethric left the chamber with a smile on his reptilian face. He would make humanity pay for every Krell death 1,000 times over. Jake sat in his quarters on Earth's fury and stared at a photograph of Emma that he kept beside his bunk. The picture showed her laughing on a beach during their last vacation before the research mission. She looked so happy and so alive. He touched the image gently and made a silent promise. He would keep fighting until the Krell were defeated or until he was dead. There was no middle ground anymore. The war had become personal in a way that transcended strategy or politics. This was about making sure that Emma's death meant something, that her short life had mattered, that the people who killed her faced justice. The war entered a new phase after Draken. Both sides knew now that this would not be a quick conflict. The Krell could no longer dismiss humans as primitive weaklings and humans.
Understood.
That victory would require sacrifice beyond anything they had imagined. Ships were built, soldiers were trained, and battle plans were drawn. The galaxy watched nervously as two civilizations committed themselves to total war. The war between humanity and the Krell sovereignty. It's been raging for 4 months, and the galaxy was starting to notice. Trade routes were disrupted as both sides attacked shipping lanes. Neutral species found themselves caught between two aggressive military powers. Refugees from border worlds flooded into neighboring systems seeking safety. The conflict that had started with the death of one child was threatening to destabilize an entire sector of space. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session at their ancient station, orbiting a neutron star. The Council was an alliance of 40 advanced civilizations that had existed for 10,000 years. Their purpose was to maintain peace and mediate disputes between spacefaring species. The council chambers were massive and decorated with artifacts from 100 different cultures. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered to discuss the human and Krell situation. Ambassador Claire Stevens represented humanity at the council. She was a career diplomat who had spent 20 years negotiating trade, agreements, and cultural exchanges before the war started. Now she stood in the most important meeting of her life, knowing that the future of her entire species might depend on what she said. She wore a simple black suit and carried a data chip containing evidence of Krell war crimes. The council session began with formal speeches and ancient rituals that had been performed for millennia. Claire watched as representatives from species she had only read about took their places. The Varaxians were tall beings made of living crystal that chimed softly when they moved. The Thul were massive creatures that looked like walking trees. The Luminari were energy beings that glowed with soft blue light. Each species had survived for thousands of years and had wisdom that humanity could barely imagine. The Krell representative spoke first. Diplomat Lord Theron was smaller than most Krell warriors, but his mind was sharp, and his words were carefully chosen. He painted a picture of humanity as aggressive newcomers who had violated Krell territorial claims and responded to legitimate defense with unprovoked military action. He described the destruction of the Draken shipyards as an act of terrorism against civilian infrastructure. He made no mention of Emma Morrison or the Horizon Explorer. Theron spoke for an hour using legal arguments and historical precedents to support his position. He cited ancient council rulings about territorial rights and the proper response to border violations. He reminded the council that the Krell had been members in good standing for over 2,000 years. While humans had only achieved faster-than-light travel a few decades ago, his implication was clear. The council should trust the established member over the newcomers. When Theron finished speaking, the chamber fell silent. Many council members seemed to be considering his arguments seriously. The Krell had always been aggressive, but they had never directly challenged council authority before. Some representatives clearly wanted to avoid antagonizing such a powerful military force. Claire felt her stomach tighten as she realized that many council members might side with the Krell simply because it was easier. Then it was Claire's turn to speak. She walked to the center of the chamber and looked around at the assembled representatives. She held up the data chip and asked permission to present evidence. The council speaker, an ancient luminary named Keeper Soren, granted permission. Claire loaded the chip into the chamber's holographic system and the footage from the Horizon Explorer began to play. The council watched in silence as the small research vessel was surrounded by Krell warships. They heard Jake Morrison's desperate attempts to negotiate and offer peaceful withdrawal. They saw War Master Zethric's cruel smile as he rejected all diplomacy. Then they watched as Krell ships deliberately targeted the disabled vessel's living quarters. The footage showed Lisa Morrison shielding her daughter, Emma with her own body in the final seconds before the plasma blast hit. The hologram froze on Emma's face. She was 7 years old, with brown hair and frightened eyes. Claire let the image hang in the air for a long moment before speaking. Her voice was steady, but filled with emotion. She told the council that this child had done nothing wrong. She had not violated any territory or threatened anyone. She had simply existed, and that was enough for the Krell to murder her. Claire
Ow!
described how the Krell had fired on a civilian research vessel after it was already disabled. She explained that, by any standard of civilized behavior, this was murder. She showed evidence of other incidents where Krell forces had attacked human ships without warning or provocation. She laid out a pattern of aggression and contempt that the Krell had shown toward humanity from their very first contact. Then Claire addressed the Council's unspoken concerns. She said that humanity understood the difference between justice and revenge. They were not trying to exterminate the Krell or conquer their territory. They wanted the killing to stop, and they wanted the people responsible to face consequences for their actions. She said that if the Council would not help, then humanity would defend itself alone. But that a galaxy where children could be murdered without consequences was not a galaxy worth living in. The chamber erupted in debate after Claire finished speaking. The Varaxian representative stood and formally condemned the Krell actions as violations of basic moral law. Several other species joined in the condemnation. Theron tried to argue that the footage was taken out of context and that the Krell had acted within their rights. But his words rang hollow after what everyone had just witnessed. The Council debated for 3 days straight. Representatives argued about territorial rights, military necessity, proportional response, and a dozen other legal concepts. Some wanted to intervene militarily to stop the war. Others argued that the Council had no authority to interfere in conflicts between member species. The Luminari faction believed that both sides should be sanctioned equally until they agreed to peace talks. Finally, the Council reached a decision. They would not intervene militarily, but they would impose economic sanctions on the Krell sovereignty. Trade with Krell worlds would be restricted, and financial assets held in Council banks would be frozen. The Council would also provide humanitarian aid to human colonies affected by the war. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but avoided splitting the Council apart. Claire listened to the announcement and felt disappointment wash over her. The sanctions might hurt the Krell economy eventually, but they would not stop the war. Humanitarian aid was nice, but it would not bring back the dead or protect the living. She had hoped for more from these ancient and supposedly wise species. Instead, she got political calculations and half measures. As the Council session ended and representatives began to leave, Claire gathered her materials and prepared to return to Earth. She would have to tell President Carter that humanity was on its own. The galaxy was willing to condemn the Krell with words, but not willing to actually stop them. It was a bitter lesson about how the universe really worked. Keeper Soren approached Claire as she was leaving the chamber. The ancient Luminari floated beside her and spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He told her that the Council's decision was not as simple as it appeared. Many members wanted to help humanity, but they were constrained by laws and traditions that predated most current civilizations. Soren explained that the Council had been watching humanity's rise with great interest. Humans had advanced faster than almost any species in recorded history. They showed remarkable creativity and adaptability. But they also showed a capacity for violence that worried many Council members. The war with the Krell was a test in some ways. The Council wanted to see how humanity would handle overwhelming pressure. Claire felt anger rising in her chest. She asked if Emma Morrison was just a test subject then, if her death was acceptable because it let ancient aliens study human reactions. Soren's glow dimmed slightly and he said no. The child's death was a tragedy that should never have happened. But now that it had happened, the Council wanted to see if humanity would seek justice or revenge. If they would show wisdom or simply lash out in anger, Soren told Claire something that was not supposed to be shared with non-Council species. He said that several powerful Council members were quietly hoping humanity would win the war. The Krell had become arrogant and cruel over the centuries. They needed to be humbled and taught that might did not make right. But the Council could not be seen to take sides openly because it would undermine their authority as neutral mediators. Claire did not know what to say to that. She felt like she was being manipulated by forces beyond her understanding. Ancient species playing games with human lives and calling it wisdom. She thanked Soren for his honesty and left the station to return to Earth. On the long journey home, she thought about everything she had learned. The Council was not going to save humanity. They were going to watch and judge and maybe offer sympathy afterward. Earth would have to win this war on its own and prove to the galaxy that humans deserved respect. Claire recorded a message for President Carter explaining the situation. She recommended that humanity ignore the Council completely and focus on defeating the Krell through military force. Back on Earth, Jake Morrison heard about the Council's decision and felt nothing but contempt. He had never expected help from aliens who had never met Emma and could not understand what her death meant. The Council could keep their sanctions and their humanitarian aid. Humans would handle this themselves the way they had always handled their problems, through determination, sacrifice, and refusing to give up no matter what the odds were. The war continued with renewed intensity after the Council session. The Krell saw the weak Council response as permission to escalate their attacks. They began targeting human colonies directly, trying to break Earth's will to fight. Entire settlements were bombarded from orbit, and millions of civilians died. War Master Zethric personally led several of these attacks and seemed to take pleasure in the destruction he caused. Humanity responded by intensifying their own military operations. Admiral Grant authorized deep strikes into Krell territory aimed at military and industrial targets. Human special forces conducted raids on Krell command centers and communication hubs. The war became brutal and desperate, with both sides suffering terrible losses. The galaxy watched nervously as two civilizations tried to destroy each other. While the Council debated procedures and protocols, Claire returned to Earth and met with President Carter. She delivered her report and her recommendation. Carter listened carefully and then made a decision. Earth would show the galaxy exactly what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. They would win this war not through Council intervention or diplomatic maneuvering, but through sheer determination and superior tactics. And when it was over, the galaxy would never underestimate humanity again. 6 months had passed since the war began, and both sides were exhausted. The Krell sovereignty had lost over a third of its fleet and dozens of colony worlds. Human casualties numbered in the millions, with entire settlements wiped out by Krell bombardments. But humanity's industrial capacity and adaptive tactics had proven superior. For every human ship destroyed, 2 Krell vessels were sent to the scrapyard. The balance of power was shifting, and everyone knew it. Jake Morrison had been promoted to captain after his previous commander was killed in action. He now commanded a heavy cruiser called the Valiant Dawn, one of the newest and most powerful ships in the human fleet. His crew respected him not just for his tactical skill, but for his absolute refusal to waste lives on pointless gestures. Jake fought smart, and he fought hard. And his people knew he would do everything possible to bring them home alive. Intelligence reports indicated that War Master Zethric had consolidated the remaining Krell fleet at their homeworld for a final defensive stand. The Krell home system was the heart of their empire, and losing it would mean the end of their civilization as a galactic power. Zethric had gathered 800 warships, along with orbital defense platforms and minefields. It was the most heavily defended location in Krell space. Admiral Grant assembled the largest human armada ever created for one final push. Over 400 ships gathered at a staging point just outside Krell territory. Grant knew that this battle would decide the war. If humanity won, the Krell would be forced to surrender. If they lost, Earth would be vulnerable to counterattack, and the war might drag on for years. Everything depended on the next few days. Jake stood on the bridge of the Valiant Dawn as the fleet prepared to jump. He looked at the faces of his crew and saw fear mixed with determination. They all knew what was coming. Many of them would not survive the battle. But they also knew why they were fighting. Images of Emma Morrison and thousands of other victims were displayed throughout the ship. This was not about conquest or glory. This was about justice and making sure that no other children died the way Emma had. The fleet jumped together and emerged in Krell home space. The sight that greeted them was terrifying. The Krell fleet stretched across the view screen in a massive defensive formation. Orbital platforms bristled with weapons. Minefields created deadly barriers that would shred any ship that tried to pass through them. Admiral Grant had expected heavy defenses, but this was beyond anything intelligence had predicted. The Krell had bet everything on this final battle. Grant gave the order to engage, and the largest battle in human history began. The human fleet divided into task forces that attacked from multiple angles simultaneously. The Valiant Dawn led a spearhead formation aimed directly at the center of the Krell line where War Master Zethric's flagship was positioned. Jake knew that destroying or capturing Zethric would break the Krell command structure and possibly end the battle quickly. Space erupted in fire, fury as hundreds of ships opened fire at once. Plasma bolts crossed with railgun rounds and missile swarms. Ships exploded in brilliant flashes that briefly outshone nearby stars. Human vessels used their superior maneuverability to dodge between Krell ships while concentrating fire on weak points. The Krell fought with the desperation of a species facing extinction. The battle raged for 8 hours without pause. Jake's crew worked their stations with mechanical precision born from months of constant combat. The weapons officer called out targets while the helm officer executed evasive maneuvers. The engineering team kept the ship running despite taking multiple hits. Everyone knew their job and did it without hesitation. The Valiant Dawn punched through the outer defensive line after 4 hours of brutal fighting. Jake could see Zethric's flagship ahead, a massive battleship 3 times the size of his cruiser. The flagship was surrounded by elite guard ships that formed a protective screen. Breaking through that screen would be nearly impossible, but Jake had no choice. He ordered his squadron to concentrate all fire on a single point in the defensive formation. Human ships hammered the same section of the Krell defensive screen over and over. Shields collapsed under the sustained barrage and 2 guard ships were destroyed. The Valiant Dawn accelerated through the gap, with enemy fire tearing at its armor. Alarms blared as systems failed, but the ship kept moving forward. Jake focused on the flagship and nothing else. This was what he had been fighting for since the day he woke up in that hospital bed. Then something unexpected happened. As the Valiant Dawn closed in on the flagship, Jake's targeting computer locked onto the enemy vessel's engines and weapon systems. He had a clear shot that would cripple the ship. His finger hovered over the firing control, and he thought about Emma. He thought about Lisa. He thought about every human who had died in this war. The rage that had burned inside him for 6 months demanded that he destroy this ship and everyone on it. But then Jake remembered something Keeper Soren had said at the Galactic Council. The ancient being had talked about whether humanity would seek justice or revenge. Jake realized that this moment would define not just him, but all of humanity in the eyes of the galaxy. They could be destroyers, or they could be something better. Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of destroying the flagship, he ordered his weapons officer to target only the engines and weapons. The Valiant Dawn fired and disabled Zethric's ship without destroying it. The massive battleship went dead in space, unable to fight or flee. Jake immediately ordered Marine assault teams to prepare for boarding operations. The Marines breached the Krell's flagship and fought their way through corridors filled with desperate defenders. Jake personally led the assault team that reached the command deck. They burst through the doors with weapons ready and found War Master Zethric standing alone. His bridge crew had already surrendered, but Zethric refused to give up. He held a plasma pistol, and his yellow eyes blazed with defiant rage. Zethric expected to be killed on the spot. He had murdered civilians and committed countless war crimes. By any measure of justice, he deserved death. Jake raised his weapon and aimed it directly at the War Master's head. His finger tightened on the trigger. This was the being who had ordered the attack on the Horizon Explorer. This was the creature who had killed Emma, but Jake lowered his weapon. He looked Zethric in the eyes and spoke in a voice cold as the vacuum of space. He said that Zethric would not be executed like a common criminal. He would be taken into custody and tanned trial for his crimes. He would face justice, not revenge. Jake said that this was the difference between humans and Krell, between civilization and barbarism. Zethric was stunned. In Krell culture, defeated enemies were always killed immediately. The concept of a trial or judicial process was foreign to him. Jake ordered his Marines to take Zethric into custody and secure the flagship. With their commander captured, the remaining Krell fleet began to lose cohesion. Individual ships started surrendering rather than fighting to the death. Admiral Grant broadcast a message to all Krell forces offering terms of surrender. If they laid down their weapons immediately, they would be treated as prisoners of war under proper legal protections. If they continued fighting, they would be destroyed. One by one, Krell ships powered down their weapons and accepted capture. Within hours, the battle was over. The Krell sovereignty surrendered 3 days later. Their government had no choice with their fleet destroyed and their military leader in human custody. The Galactic Council reconvened to oversee peace negotiations. The terms were harsh but fair. The Krell would pay reparations to humanity for war damages. They would cede territory that had been in dispute. Their military would be limited in size and subject to inspections. War Master Zethric and other war criminals would stand trial before an impartial tribunal. The trial lasted 2 months and was broadcast across the galaxy. Evidence of Krell atrocities was presented in detail. Zethric and his officers were found guilty of numerous war crimes, including the murder of civilians. The tribunal sentenced Zethric to life imprisonment on a neutral world where he would spend the rest of his days thinking about what he had done. Humanity emerged from the war, transformed. No longer seen as primitive newcomers, humans were now respected and feared throughout the galaxy. The United Earth government was offered a seat on the Galactic Council, which President Carter accepted. Earth would have a voice in galactic affairs and the ability to shape the future of multiple civilizations. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Millions of humans had died. Entire worlds had been devastated. The economic burden of rebuilding would take decades. Jake Morrison looked at the casualty lists and felt the weight of every single name. He had survived when so many others had not, and the guilt of that survival haunted him. Jake retired from military service after the war ended. He could not continue fighting after everything he had seen and done. Instead, he dedicated his life to something positive. He established the Emma Morrison Foundation, an organization that promoted peaceful exploration and protected civilians in conflict zones. The foundation worked across species boundaries to prevent future wars and ensure that no other children died the way Emma had. On the first anniversary of Emma's death, memorial services were held across human space. Thousands gathered at monuments and remembrance sites to honor those who had been lost. Jake stood at the central memorial on Earth, a massive wall where the names of every human killed in the war were inscribed. He found Emma's name among millions of others and placed his hand on the cold stone. Tears streamed down Jake's face as he whispered to his daughter. He told her that they had won the war, but that victory felt hollow without her. He said that humanity had proven itself capable of terrible violence, when threatened, but also capable of mercy when victory was in their grasp. He hoped that she would be proud of the choices he had made and the path humanity had chosen. As the sun set over the memorial, people began lighting candles in remembrance. The light spread across the gathering like stars appearing in the night sky. Jake watched and realized that Emma's death had not been meaningless. It had changed everything. Humanity had been forced to unite and prove itself worthy of respect. The galaxy would never see humans as weak or primitive again. In schools across Earth, children learned about Emma Morrison and the war that followed her death. Teachers explained how one tragedy had sparked a conflict that reshaped galactic politics. But they also taught about the importance of justice over revenge and the value of showing mercy even to enemies. Emma became a symbol not just of innocence lost, but of the principles humanity chose to uphold even in the darkest times. Jake eventually adopted a daughter named Sophie, who had lost her parents in a Krell bombardment. He raised her with love and taught her about Emma and Lisa. Sophie grew up knowing that she was part of a larger story, that her existence honored those who had been lost. She became a teacher herself and dedicated her life to educating the next generation. It's about peace and understanding. The war had ended, but its lessons lived on. Humanity had proven itself powerful enough to defeat a galactic empire, but wise enough to show restraint at the moment of victory. The galaxy watched and learned that humans could be dangerous enemies, but also honorable friends. Earth's place among the stars was secured, not through conquest, but through the strength to fight and the wisdom to know when to stop.